Did you know that Snow White wasn't originally created by Disney? Do you know the true origin of the Snow White story? Why did Disney adopt this and other fairy tales to make their movies? What do Snow White, the evil queen, the poisoned apple, the prince, and the seven dwarfs really represent? Before we get started, don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with our latest content. And stay until the end, where we'll reveal a surprising reason behind the current controversy surrounding the latest version of Snow White by the famous mouse company. Now, let's dive into the original version of Snow White as published by the Brothers Grimm in 1812. The story begins with a queen, sewing by a window in the middle of winter. As she pricks her finger with a needle, 3 drops of blood fall onto the snow, inspiring her to wish for a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the ebony window frame. Soon after, she gives birth to a daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. Tragically, the queen dies shortly after, and the king remarries a vain and wicked woman who becomes the evil queen. The evil queen, obsessed with being the fairest of all, consults her magic mirror daily, until one day, the mirror tells her that Snow White has surpassed her in beauty. Furious, the queen orders a huntsman to take Snow White into the forest and kill her. But the huntsman, moved by the girl's innocence, spares her life and tells her to flee. Snow White finds refuge in a small cottage belonging to 7 dwarfs. Grateful for their hospitality, she helps with the household chores, and they welcome her as a sister. But the evil queen, upon discovering Snow White is still alive, makes 3 attempts to kill her, each more sinister than the last. Finally, she succeeds with a poisoned apple, and Snow White falls into a deep, death-like sleep. The dwarfs, heartbroken, place her in a glass coffin. Time passes, and one day, a prince who has heard of Snow White's beauty finds her and is so struck by her appearance that he asks to take her with him. As his servants carry the coffin, they stumble, dislodging the piece of poisoned apple from Snow White's throat, reviving her. The story concludes with Snow White and the prince marrying, while the evil queen meets a grim fate. The story of Snow White comes to us thanks to the Brothers Grimm, who collected and reworked many folk tales in the early 19th century. Specifically, the tale was published in 1812. At that time, Germany was not a unified country but a collection of independent states. The nation was undergoing significant social and economic changes, with the Industrial Revolution beginning to transform life across Europe. As more people moved from rural areas to cities in search of work, traditional ways of life were rapidly changing. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were philologists and folklorists deeply interested in preserving the oral and cultural traditions of the German regions. Many of the stories they collected, including Snow White, have roots in legends and folk tales passed down orally through generations. These tales often reflect the concerns, fears, and values of the people in society at that time, capturing the essence of a rapidly changing world. But why did Disney choose to adapt Snow White and other classic fairy tales into their animated movies? One significant reason is that these stories were in the public domain, meaning they were no longer protected by copyright. This allowed Disney to use and adapt these tales without paying for the rights. Public domain works are those whose copyright protection has expired, or that were never subject to copyright in the first place. This allows anyone to use, modify, and adapt them without needing to pay royalties or seek permission. Many of the fairy tales Disney adapted, such as Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and The Little Mermaid, among others, are traditional stories that have existed for centuries. The versions written by authors like the Brothers Grimm, Charles Perrault, and Hans Christian Andersen had already passed into the public domain by the time Disney began working on their adaptations. Disney's first animated feature film, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, 1937, was based on the tale collected by the Brothers Grimm. Since the story was in the public domain, Disney was able to freely adapt it, making modifications to ensure it was suitable for children in the cinematic format. Even though the base stories were in the public domain, Disney uniquely adapted them by adding new elements, characters, and songs, which are protected by copyright. This is why, although the original Snow White story is in the public domain, Disney's specific versions and their creative elements, such as the names of the dwarfs or the songs, are copyrighted. There were other reasons for Disney's choice as well. Fairy tales were widely known and had universal appeal, meaning there was already an audience familiar with the stories, making it easier to attract viewers to the movies. Additionally, these tales often contained moral lessons, making them appealing to families and valuable for children's education, something Disney also valued in their content. The Brothers Grimm's Snow White has been the subject of various interpretations over time, covering psychological, social, and cultural aspects. These interpretations explore the underlying and symbolic meanings of the tale, reflecting the concerns and values of society in different eras. Psychological interpretation: Freud and Jung's psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, two of the founders of modern psychology, greatly influenced the interpretation of fairy tales. From a Freudian perspective, Snow White can be seen as a representation of Oedipal conflicts, with the relationship between Snow White and her stepmother symbolizing the tension between daughter and mother for the father's, the king's, attention. The evil queen's envy towards Snow White's youth and beauty may represent maternal jealousy and the fear of being replaced. Carl Jung, on the other hand, would interpret the characters and elements of the story as archetypes from the collective unconscious. Snow White could represent the maiden or innocent archetype, while the stepmother symbolizes the shadow, or the darker side of the human psyche. Snow White's journey, including her apparent death and resurrection, could be seen as a process of individuation, where the protagonist integrates both her conscious and unconscious aspects. Social interpretation: gender roles. The story has been critiqued from the perspective of gender roles. Snow White is often seen as a passive character, whose primary virtues are her beauty and purity. Her eventual rescue by a prince can be interpreted as perpetuating the idea that women must be saved by men, and that their main value lies in their appearance and submissive nature. On the other hand, the evil queen is a powerful but negative character who uses her power for destructive purposes. This can be seen as reflecting suspicion and fear towards women who exercise power, suggesting that strong women are dangerous or morally corrupt. Social class and labor. The dwarfs working in the mines can be viewed as a representation of the working class. Some analysts see them as a reflection of exploited workers during the Industrial Revolution, who lived in precarious conditions while performing exhausting labor. In the Grimm Brothers' tale, the dwarfs are characters who live together in a small house in the forest and offer Snow White refuge when she flees from her stepmother. Traditionally, the dwarfs are portrayed as hardworking and kind beings who take care of Snow White as a sort of surrogate family. Some modern analyses of fairy tales have interpreted the dwarfs as orphan children who were exploited during the Industrial Revolution. However, this is a more contemporary interpretation and not necessarily what the Grimm brothers had in mind when they collected the story. Regarding orphan children, it is true that in the 19th century, especially with the rise of industrialization, many children were orphaned or abandoned and were often forced to work under very harsh conditions. This could explain why some modern interpretations have linked the dwarfs to orphan children or exploited workers. Cultural interpretation, myths and symbolism. Snow White has also been interpreted as a mythological figure. The story parallels ancient myths and legends, such as the story of Persephone in Greek mythology, where a young girl is abducted and later resurrected. The poisoned apple carries biblical resonances, evoking the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden and the concept of original sin. The mirror, the magic mirror in the tale symbolizes the obsession with beauty and superficiality. This element reflects how society values outward appearance and how this can lead to envy and destruction. In a more modern context, the mirror can be seen as a representation of social media culture, where image and public perception are of utmost importance. Nature and civilization. The contrast between the castle, civilization, and the forest, nature, is a recurring theme in many fairy tales. In the Snow White, the forest is a place of danger but also of refuge and rebirth. Snow White's transition from the castle to the forest can be interpreted as a journey from the rigid structure of society to a more primal, wild space where she can discover her true identity. Critique of female passivity. Feminists have criticized the depiction of Snow White as a passive character whose life depends on the actions of others, particularly men. This interpretation emphasizes how traditional fairy tales perpetuate gender stereotypes that limit women's roles to being objects of desire or rewards for heroic deeds. Snow White's passivity reinforces the idea that women's value lies in their beauty and submissiveness, rather than in their agency or capability to shape their own destinies. Empowerment and the stepmother. On the other hand, some feminist interpretations have re-examined the character of the evil queen, seeing her as a figure of female empowerment, albeit a twisted one. Despite her role as the antagonist, the evil queen is an active and powerful character who refuses to conform to traditional female passivity. However, her power is portrayed negatively, reflecting societal fears about strong, ambitious women and the destructive potential of female power when it is not aligned with traditional moral values. The prince. The feminist critique also extends to the character of the prince, who is often seen as a problematic figure representing the dynamics of male saviorism. His role in rescuing Snow White by awakening her with a kiss reinforces the notion that women are passive beings who need to be saved by men. This interpretation also brings into question the issue of consent, as Snow White is unconscious when the prince kisses her, raising concerns about autonomy and power in romantic relationships. Alternative views of the prince. Beyond the feminist perspective, other interpretations of the prince exist. Some view him as a symbol of salvation and true love, a figure who restores balance and order in the narrative. Others see him simply as a narrative device, designed to bring the story to a satisfying conclusion with a happily ever after. In more critical views, the prince represents patriarchal control, as he ultimately decides Snow White's fate and reasserts male dominance in the storyline. Now, let's address the controversy surrounding Disney's latest adaptation of Snow White. In this analysis, we won't focus on the ethnic change of the character introduced by Disney. We don't find it inappropriate or objectionable, although it does stray from the original tale, which was set in 19th century in earlier Germany. What we do find relevant to discuss is how Disney's 1937 film reflects certain values that may be difficult to accept today, such as the idea that the damsel needs a prince to save her, thus reducing the woman to a purely passive role. However, in that film, Snow White shows gratitude to the dwarfs for protecting her from the evil queen, adopting a caring maternal attitude. She cooks, cleans, and helps with household chores, sharing responsibilities. In the trailer for the new version, we see a Snow White who, instead of collaborating, gives orders to the dwarfs to clean the house after they've returned from a long and exhausting day of work in the mines. Snow White does not participate in the tasks, she simply commands others to work. This shift in dynamics has sparked debate, as it seems to normalize and reinforce an unfair distribution of responsibilities in social relationships. The dwarfs, who represent the working class, are the ones who must bear all the effort, even after a long day of work, while Snow White, who symbolizes the idle class, merely gives orders without showing empathy for the dwarfs or gratitude for the shelter they provide. This approach suggests that feminism is being used as an excuse to legitimize privileges that certain people should have based on their belonging to a specific social group, whether by gender, class, or ethnicity, while others must bear all the disadvantages for not belonging to those privileged groups. This reinterpretation raises important questions about the values we want to convey to today's audiences. Have gratitude, empathy, and solidarity become outdated? Is it right to teach new generations that certain people deserve more rights and privileges than others, simply because of their gender, ethnicity, or belonging to a particular social group? What kind of society are we helping to create by promoting these values? And what do you think? Let us know your opinion in the comments. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you want us to cover a specific topic, please write it in the comments. Give this video a like and share it so your family and friends can also learn about the hidden truth behind Disney's new Snow White. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. And don't miss our recommended video at the end. You will enjoy it. Never forget, history is the imitator of time, the repository of actions, the witness of the past, the example and warning of the present. The caution for the future.